He was not just arguably the Mighty Handful's most influential members, but he was one of the greatest orchestrators of all time. I'm the Classical Nerd, and today we're talking about Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov. Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov was born into the Russian town of Tikhvin into a family of Russian nobility in March 1844. His ancestor Ivan Rimsky-Korsakov was a singer, violinist, and lover of Catherine the Great in the late 1770s. As was the custom for upper-crust families like the Rimsky-Korsakovs, there was a large tradition of military and government service. His father Andrei was for a time the vice-governor of Novgorod, and his older brother Voin was an explorer who was in the Russian Navy and even got an archipelago named after him. So if you ever find yourself in Russia's far southeast and find a Rimsky-Korsakov archipelago, it's not actually named for Nikolai. Voin was 22 years older than his kid brother, and Nikolai's birth must have been a surprise to his parents, Andrei and Sofia, who were 60 and 42 respectively. Voin's relationship to his brother was more like that of a third parent. He was actually the godfather of his brother, but he didn't see him that often because he was often off at sea. Letters would float in from the Far East, enticing young Nikolai with their sense of grandness and adventure. Young Nikolai's musicianship was not as readily apparent as it usually is in these biographies. He was pretty good at the piano, but he wasn't super into it, and he really didn't like practicing. His love was literature, and while the Rimsky-Korsakovs lived over 50 miles from the nearest major body of water and over 120 miles from the Gulf of Finland, Rimsky read all about the ocean, from not just Voin's letters, but all the things he could read about in the literature. He fell in love with the ocean and in sailing, despite never actually seeing the ocean himself. His uncle and great-grandfather had also been Navy men, and there was great interest in the family of having Nikolai follow in these family footsteps. He entered the school for mathematical and navigational sciences when he was 12 years old, and he was immediately homesick because he'd never been outside of his hometown more than like 3 times up until that point. And lo and behold, Voin was the director of the institution at the time that Nikolai was enrolled. He approved of his kid brother taking further piano lessons to broaden his experiences. And even though Nikolai still really wasn't super into music, he was exposed to a wider world of music through being in St. Petersburg. Up until that point, he was only ever exposed to music through the Russian Orthodox Church's bells and chants and processions, and not in some systematic way. His new piano teacher in St. Petersburg was a man named Ulik, who was actually a cellist, so he really wasn't an expert in this whole teaching piano thing. In 1859, Ulik told Voin that his little brother was better at the piano than even he himself was, which, to be fair, he was a cellist, so kind of a low bar. Anyway, Voin searched around to find another piano teacher for his brother, and soon found Fyodor Kanila, who would eventually be the dedicatee of Nikolai's first symphony. His eyes were opened to a wider world of music for the first time, and Nikolai would later say that this was the first time he'd ever heard a properly good piano performance. Suddenly music was interesting for him, and he started writing his own pieces to the detriment of his other studies. Contrasted with Voin, who believed that his brother's music education was just a part of a well-balanced career, and that he was not supposed to be interested in that more so than his naval studies, and Voin actually outright would cancel lessons when he felt like his brother was getting too into music and failing his exams as a result. Voin outright canceled Nikolai's lessons for good when he was 17 years old. Their father Andrei summed up the average Russian's pre-1860s view on music as a pleasurable pastime preferable to cards or drinking. It wasn't considered a serious profession. Kanila first showed Nikolai the music of Robert Schumann, considered a remarkably progressive composer in that day, as well as MIKHAIL GLINKA, who was for a time the first and only Russian composer of distinction, able to capture the sound and spirit of Russia. And although Voin had cancelled his lessons, Kanila told Nikolai to show up for his weekly lessons anyway, and in 1861 introduced his pupil to Mily Badakirov, the ringleader of the group that would become known as the Mighty Handful. At this point, both Cesar Cui and Modest Mussorgsky were part of this group, and the addition of Rimsky-Korsakov to the mix made for another aspiring amateur musician and military man who had come under the powerful influence of Balakirov's philosophy. Rimsky-Korsakov was the youngest member of this group, and this manifested in a willingness to go along with the groupthink. Balakirov prized a non-academic approach to composition and encouraged Rimsky's efforts at writing his first symphony. The symphony would eventually be cast in the key of E minor, but he started writing it it in the key of E-flat minor, and to quote my old theory professor, Russians really love writing in keys that nobody plays in. To be fair, E-flat minor is actually pretty good for the piano because there's a lot of black keys and it kind of fits under the hand, but it's not good for almost any orchestral instrument for a variety of reasons. This symphony occupied much of Rimsky-Korsakov's time at sea, as he started on a 3-year circumnavigation of the world in 1862, stopping in at various ports of call all over the globe. He finished this voyage with 3 movements of his symphony done, a piano, scores he picked up from all of these ports of call, and Hector Berlioz's treatise on instrumentation, and almost no musical gas left in the tank, so to speak. He had launched into the symphony with great enthusiasm because he'd been on land and he was surrounded by people who encouraged him. At sea, he didn't have this, and he slowly lost that enthusiasm. Once back in St. Petersburg in the middle of 1865, he was outright depressed. But soon he and Balakirov got back in touch. Rimsky was fired up to start working on his symphony again. He finished the last movement that he needed to round off the piece, totally reorchestrated it, and it was soon premiered under Balakirov's baton. Rimsky would later go on to write that part of the reason why he and the other members of the handful came under Balakirov's spell was that they believed that Balakirov knew everything, when in fact Balakirov was actually quite good at hiding what he didn't know. Rimsky-Korsakov was always eager to learn and to please his superiors, specifically Voyn and Balakirov, but he soon found that he was being too stifled. He was hooked on writing orchestral pieces, though, and wrote several in quick succession, establishing his reputation as both a fine orchestrator and a fast worker, including Sadko, which lies somewhere between a symphonic poem and a musical tableau. Meanwhile, the mighty handful was in its heyday. They'd added Alexander Borodin to their circle, and the two became good friends. Meanwhile, the relatively shy Rimsky-Korsakov often found himself blindly agreeing with Balakirov's party line of opinion, which Mussorgsky and Cui would doubtless share. Nevertheless, despite not yet forming his own musical identity as either a part of this group or away from this group, he had already established himself as their greatest orchestrator. Not only did other members of the group rely on his talent, but Alexander Dargomishsky, an alternative leader figure to Balakirov, especially for those composers who wanted to write operas, asked Rimsky-Korsakov to orchestrate his opera The Stone Guest, which he did 3 separate times. Rimsky-Korsakov ranked 3rd amongst the mighty handful, which the genesis of Sadko proves. Vladimir Stasov, a critic who was on the handful's side and would give them their nickname, suggested writing music on the ancient Slavic epic narrative poem Sadko to Balakirov, who first offered it to Mussorgsky before then handing it off to Rimsky-Korsakov. This is not to be confused with Rimsky-Korsakov's later opera of the same name, from which materials of this musical tableau were pulled. Although the date of 1870 is often given as the last hurrah of the mighty handful, this gives Balakirov too much credit as their linchpin. In reality, the 4 composers not named Balakirov were actually on fairly good terms with one another. Mussorgsky and Rimsky-Korsakov were roommates in 1871, and that was a mutually beneficial relationship. Rimsky helped Mussorgsky out of too much trouble and helped him focus his style and refine it a little bit from the rough-hewn style that he was used to writing in, and Mussorgsky influenced Rimsky-Korsakov's operas, specifically in his style of declamatory vocal writing. And Mussorgsky was actually the best man at Rimsky-Korsakov's wedding when he married Nadezhda Pergold, but this proved to be one of the final blows that started off Mussorgsky's final slide into the alcoholism that would kill him, because not living with Rimsky wasn't a very good thing for his mental health. 1871 was also when Rimsky-Korsakov, all of 27 years old, was asked if he would teach composition and orchestration at the St. Petersburg Conservatory. While Sadko was a great success, as was his follow-up Antar Symphony, in the same somewhat exotic vein, this move was unexpected. For one, the mighty handful frequently launched polemics against the conservatory system, especially in Cui's writings and Balakirov's interactions with, well, pretty much anybody. Second, none of them had any formal training. MIKHAIL AZANCHEVSKY, the new director of the conservatory, was willing to cross party lines, as it were, and the offer to Rimsky-Korsakov was the best option. His music was well received by pretty much everyone, especially for its masterful orchestration. Not only did AZANCHEVSKY think that Rimsky-Korsakov could actually offer something to his students, but he might have felt like this was an olive branch to the nationalist school that the handful was an exponent of. Surprisingly, Balakirev was actually on board with Rimsky-Korsakov's hiring, with the thinking that it was good to have one of their own in the enemy camp, so to speak, and perhaps he could use that to slowly shift the conservatory system towards a more nationalistic way of thinking. After all, Balakirev was not necessarily opposed to a school. He was influential in starting a free school of music as the antithesis to the conservatory system. They just disliked the third-rate Germans that they thought that Anton Rubinstein was putting on his concert programs. The problem was that Rimsky-Korsakov knew almost nothing about what he was going to teach. He had devoured Berlioz's treatise on instrumentation, but instrumentation and orchestration are two different things. Instrumentation often shows how to use different instruments independently, and orchestration is more about putting it all together. When he'd met Balakirev, he knew less about music theory than some absolute beginners. Part writing? Forget about it. Counterpoint? Also forget about it. Scales? How were they formed? He had a decent idea, but intervals, what were they called? Who could say? While he learned some from Balakirev, it didn't include some of these basic skills that we would think are fundamental to an understanding of music. It's amazing, really, that he got as good at orchestration as he did. Some of the greatest orchestrators of all time were themselves conductors. Think Gustav Mahler or Richard Strauss. And Rimsky-Korsakov was banned and barred by regulations from appearing as the conductor of any of his works, because as a naval officer he always had to be in uniform, and they didn't like the idea of a uniformed officer being on stage and conducting an orchestra. Learning through doing might have worked for Balakirev, and he thought it would work for everybody else, but that didn't translate to being able to go into a classroom and actually teach this stuff. Rimsky-Korsakov only accepted this post after talking with the mighty handful's resident enemy, one Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky, who had studied at St. Petersburg and was now a professor in Moscow. Tchaikovsky's advice was for Rimsky-Korsakov to study his brains out, and that he did, taking a 3-year break from composing works to start from the ground up in a crash course of standard musical study. This was ostensibly so he could stay one step ahead of the students he was teaching, but as he taught himself the rigors and went through from the basics to the advanced so he could pass the information that he learned in the morning onto his students in the evening, so to speak, he came to realize that Balakirev was not entirely right on the supposed dangers of academic training. And he now actually did work with an orchestra up close and personal. He conducted the student orchestra in St. Petersburg because the Navy had created a post for him as the inspector of naval bands. He wanted to play as many woodwind and brass instruments as possible, which Borodin, a fairly skilled amateur flute player, was really encouraging of. He reintegrated his newfound musical technique into a systematic comb-through of his older pieces, and he was inspired in this regard in part by his wife Nadezhda. Nadezhda knew more about the technical side of music when they had married, and she was a pianist who had studied at the St. Petersburg Conservatory. Comparisons have been made to the partnership of Robert and Clara Schumann. And not without merit. While Nadezhda abandoned her nascent compositional career when they married, her influence was astounding, not only in her husband's pieces, but also in her work in preserving his legacy after his death. Again, much like what Clara did with Robert's works. Except Rimsky-Korsakov never went insane and tried to jump off a bridge to kill himself, so it makes for a less interesting story. There was, of course, a mighty backlash to Rimsky-Korsakov's turn towards the academic. In fact, he became estranged from some of his old friends due to his now academic outlook on music. Not only was this obviously unpopular and anathema for the nationalist composers of the mighty handful and their followers, but even Tchaikovsky, conservatory-trained himself, believed that Rimsky-Korsakov's new style was simply too dry. Even Anton Rubinstein, who was the closest thing that the handful ever had to a true arch-enemy, wasn't a huge fan of Rimsky-Korsakov's turn towards music that more he would have written versus the music that Balakirev would have written. This thankfully didn't last very long, because by the mid-1870s, Rimsky-Korsakov was tasked, along with Balakirev, of going through Mikhail Glinka's scores and editing them. Balakirev, the only member of the group to actually have met Glinka, wanted to touch up Glinka's works in the same way that he touched up, i.e. rewrote, a lot of his students' and pupils' works. Rimsky-Korsakov disagreed, and ultimately he won out. The edition that was published is much closer to Glinka's original texts and manuscripts than Balakirev's desire to edit them. And it was through this editing process that Rimsky-Korsakov rediscovered his love for modern music. This project centered Rimsky-Korsakov on an equal balance between the academic training that he had given himself and the nationalistic music that he'd started out loving so much. This defined his music from there on out, and this began to show its influence in his next two operas, May Night and The Snow Maiden. Rimsky-Korsakov's skill as an editor kept him busy in the 1880s, when he was otherwise suffering from a creative writer's block. His old roommate Mussorgsky was the first of the handful members to pass away in 1881, and Rimsky-Korsakov was the obvious choice to finish off his old friend and roommate's works. While I've documented this far more in my Mussorgsky video, it's Rimsky-Korsakov who is mostly responsible for what we know as Night on Bald Mountain, which is ironic considering that his attitude towards editing Glinka's pieces was pretty much the opposite of how he rigorously edited and recomposed Mussorgsky's piece. In early 1884, his job was eliminated and Rimsky-Korsakov started working with Balakirev again, this time at the Imperial Chapel, which allowed the both of them to more intensely study the music of Russian Orthodoxy. Alexander Borodin was the next to go, and Rimsky-Korsakov was so distraught at this sudden death at a party that he couldn't sleep the night he heard the news. Again, he was pressed into service to complete what Borodin had left behind, particularly his opera Prince Igor. He worked on this with Alexander Glazunov, and due to the nightmarish state of Borodin's files, the two composers ended up trashing about a fifth of what Borodin had written and collaborated on what became known to audiences as Prince Igor. What Rimsky understood is that if these pieces were to live on, they needed to be in their best form to put before the public. Rimsky went so far as to write that his version of Night at Bald Mountain was simply to put the best foot forward on Mussorgsky's behalf. It's doubtful as to whether or not Rimsky ever intended his version to be the definitive version. This period also saw Rimsky-Korsakov frequently attending the home of Mitrofan Belyaev, a wood magnate and music publisher who sponsored nationalist composers of the post-Mighty Handful generation. Belyaev was interested by the possibility of putting on a concert series devoted to Russian music and sponsored the Russian Symphony concerts starting in 1886. These concerts not only saw the premiere of Rimsky's version of Night on Bald Mountain, but it also helped break him out of his creative slump. For these concerts, he wrote such famous pieces as Scheherazade, the Capriccio Espagnole, and the Russian Easter Overture. These works show Rimsky-Korsakov at the height of his powers. He didn't feel the need to be overly nationalistic, and he had learned the techniques and he had ingrained the techniques that he'd learned, such that he wasn't writing pieces that were intentionally so chock full of counterpoint as he'd done when he first was exposing himself to the rigors of academic musical study. Instead, they were all synthesized into his mature musical style. The Russian Easter Overture was based off of the Obikhod, the Orthodox Church's collection of canticles, and was the first major piece to do this. Tsar Alexander III, much more conservative than his father Alexander II, was upset at Rimsky's choice and banned the piece from being played in his presence. This streak of orchestral pieces came to a halt in early 1889 for a few reasons. The first was that, despite the enduring popularity of pieces like Scheherazade, its premiere was almost cancelled because the Imperial Russian Music Society feared that it would corrupt the youth's tastes, and once accepted, Rimsky only got 50 rubles, half of the customary 100, on the grounds that it was far too light to be a truly symphonic work. This was also around the time he first saw Richard Wagner's landmark Ring Cycle. The mighty handful had taken issue with Wagner's musical style and techniques, but Rimsky was delighted at, well, what else? The orchestration. He devoted time to studying how Wagner used the orchestra in his operas, and from there out dedicated himself to writing nothing but opera. Yet as he aged, his attitude towards modern music became ever more stifled, and he eventually turned his back on Wagner as well. This, in addition to increasing physical ailments, led to another round of writer's block, when he also left his posts at the Russian Symphony concerts and the Imperial Chapel. His mother had died, his youngest child had died, his second youngest was at death's door, and his wife and another one of his kids had bad cases of diphtheria. Eventually, things turned around enough for him to return to operatic writing, and he once again resumed his incredibly prolific pace. He would average 2 operas every 3 years, from 1894 to 1907. The most Wagnerian any of these operas got was Mlada, which started life as a group project for the mighty handful, minus Balakirev, in the early 1870s. Rimsky kept thinking about the project and wrote his own full version between 1889 and 1890, and this project was a spectacle. Half opera, half ballet, and larger in scope than all his previous projects. He also employed his biggest orchestra to date, quadrupling a lot of the woodwinds and calling for rarer instruments. When the 1905 revolutions swept through Russia and instituted the first democratic reforms, Rimsky-Korsakov was tapped by the St. Petersburg Conservatory to be the liaison between the students and the administration. When Rimsky-Korsakov threw his lot in behind the students, saying that they had a right to protest injustice as they saw it, they fired him, along with expelling 100 other students, which only made the remaining students at the conservatory incredibly frustrated, and they got even more violent and angry. When there was talk of rehiring Rimsky, he refused, and instead taught his students from his home. Him standing up for his beliefs and on the side of democratic reforms led to serious political entanglements. A production of his opera Cachet the Deathless was marked by a student demonstration, and the authorities believed that his music was too subversive and too much of a point of potential flare-ups, and they banned performances of it. This got a lot of bad press, and Rimsky didn't just get notes of sympathy in the mail, he got a lot of money through the mail as well. The remaining faculty at the conservatory quit, and most of the students left with them. The conservatory's administration was pressed into rehiring everyone and accepting all the students back, and Rimsky-Korsakov, by the end of the year, was back at his old job, with Alexander Glazunov as the new director. Oh, and in a twist of irony, Rimsky-Korsakov straight up retired the following year. He just wanted to end on his terms, not anyone else's. Oh, and one of his last pupils was a minor and little-known Russian composer named Igor Stravinsky. Rimsky-Korsakov continued working until December 1907, and he died in June 1908. His final opera, The Golden Cockerel, was a piece of biting satire aimed directly at the Tsar and designed to insult him as much as humanly possible. This was in retaliation for the Russian government's incompetency, which is why there was a revolution in the first place. Rimsky-Korsakov was one of the most prolific members of the mighty handful, but this was tempered by occasional writer's blocks that allowed him the chance to go back and edit not just others' works, but also his own. The story of Rimsky's work is that of a composer of immense talent who struggled for many years to find the right balance between the sounds of his homeland and things that he filtered in from points further west. Ironically, even though he was largely interested in opera and was known for being an opera composer throughout his life, his operas haven't stuck around in the repertoire in the way that others have. And his orchestral pieces, which come from a very small period in his career, are the ones that have been the mainstays on orchestral programs since. While piano music features less prominently in Rimsky's works, vis-a-vis other members of the mighty handful, he did write some significant piano pieces, including a C-sharp minor piano concerto, Opus 30, from the early 1880s. Of his orchestral works, the ones with programs, that is, those that portray a story in some way or another, are his most well-known. He developed a whole catalog of orchestral tricks, from imitating bells through the use of woodwinds and pizzicato strings, to the imitation of the East Slavic zither known as the gusli, which he adapted from Mikhail Glinka's use of the same imitation. For his second-to-last opera, The Legend of the Invisible City of Kitezh, Rimsky originally wanted an orchestra of 30 Russian folk instruments on stage, but abandoned this because they just couldn't be heard over the full orchestra because those instruments weren't refined for many years to project in a concert hall. He was particularly fond of using the orchestra as a coloristic means to an end, and his knowledge of woodwind and brass instruments only helped him in this regard. His orchestrations were colorful, inventive, and virtuosic, but most importantly, they were also idiomatic for the instruments that he was writing for. This is why pieces like Scheherazade or the Russian Easter Overture are so memorable. He's combining the skill at telling a story through sound with his immense bag of tricks when it came to using the orchestra to its maximum possible extent. This love of storytelling, which can be linked to his early love of literature, can be seen throughout his operas, for which he was often the librettist. Oddly, while Mussorgsky was always interested in making his operatic characters as naturalistic as possible, Rimsky was not a fan of naturalism on stage. Mainly, he didn't want the characters, if they weren't singing, to distract from whatever character was singing. As it happened, as opera moved into the 20th century, opera composers adopted a more Mussorgskian approach, which is why you're much more likely to see a production of Boris Godunov than literally any Rimsky-Korsakov opera, despite Rimsky writing more than Mussorgsky ever did. At the same time, he was an expert at actually portraying the natural world in his music. It's a different kind of naturalism because he was able to imitate the sights and sounds of places that he'd been. This is in part because he was synesthetic, that is, his brain was wired together in such a way that he heard sounds whenever he saw colors and vice versa. For him, sounds and tonalities had particular coloristic associations, and he used this to imbue hidden meaning into his works. E major, for instance, was blue, so if you're talking about the C, E major is going to crop up. D major was gold, so when you're talking about something that's golden in color, D major is going to crop up. Because music had sound in it and vice versa, it's possible that he used this ability to retain memories with more distinction and with more vivid detail than non-synesthetic colleagues. As inspector of naval bands, Rimsky-Korsakov had the ability to get up close and personal with all these instruments and really familiarize himself with what they did and could do. This allowed him to write a textbook on orchestration, one of the first, naturally, with musical examples drawn from his own works. This was an unprecedented work. It actually took him 3 different tries to finish this thing off, and he left it almost completed his death. Technically, this was completed by his son-in-law, the composer Maximilian Steinberg. Despite his turn towards valuing formal study in an academic environment, his classes never went beyond the basics. He never went into particular details of style that Balakirev had ironically both done and feared that the conservatories would do to their students. Despite dedicating many pieces to oriental or exotic elements, he always felt not really at ease using this in his subject matter. He had very little exposure to the real thing on a long-term level, although he did expose himself to all sorts of world musics. He had heard Native American music in New York when he was traveling around the world while he was still in the Navy, and he heard Algerian music in 1889 at the Paris World's Exposition. He knew superficially of the music of Russian Asia, but he didn't claim to be familiar with it enough to really write music that was in that vein. Instead of trying to absorb everything, he would take note of particular elements of what a musician was doing, be it harmony and rhythm and form or gestures or what have you, and then try to use one of those elements in his music. That would turn into a tangible representation of that musical style in his own style. He also, beyond his studies with Balakirev, used quotations of themes that Balakirev had collected in the Caucasus and beyond. Rimsky-Korsakov believed that art was above reality, and that an artistic truth needn't be a realistic truth. The idealization of reality is strongly tied into his pantheistic upbringing and worldview, and echoed the prevailing outlook among educated Russians of his time. This outlook would help sour his relationship to the composers with whom he was once close, but helped define him as a unique orchestral thinker, a synthesizer of the academic and the anti-academic, and above all a link between the emergent national feeling of Balakirev's circle and the innovations of the next generation of Sergei Prokofiev and Igor Stravinsky.